Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much, Jonathan. And bore da pawb. Good morning, everybody. Like Sue, I recently became a grandparent for the first time. So my daughter is researching options for childcare, and as a parent, I've used childminding, nurseries, and after-school clubs in the past. So like many people, I've got a personal interest as well as a professional interest in childcare and play. So Bev, if we could have the first slide, please. There we are. Thank you. Diolch. So I'm going to spend 10 minutes, and there's a good incentive for me to just spend 10 minutes because a fire alarm is going to go off in this building as a test at 10:40, which will be very disruptive. So if I'm going at quite a lick, that's the explanation, folks. And so I'm going to spend about 10 minutes running through some of the significant findings from the last self-assessment of service statement, the SASS, as it's known, submitted by Childcare and Play Services, registered with CIW. I'd like to say something about trends in the last few years and offer a few reflections on the impact of the pandemic based on our engagement with yourselves as providers. Just to say, 90% of providers registered with us submitted a SASS. That's a brilliant response rate, helped by the fact that the whole process is now online, and nearly all the providers registered with us now do have online accounts. So a big thank you to those today for doing that. Firstly, though, just a word about the title of this conference and the title of Jonathan and my presentations in the agenda there: Wellbeing and Resilience, Recovery and Renewal. They are good words representing laudable aspirations, and I use them as much as the next person. My personal view is that we need to think carefully about what we mean when we use these words. What sort of recovery and renewal do we want? A return to where we were before? Somewhere different? Somewhere better? And most importantly, what sort of recovery and renewal will do the best for the children and the families who use your services? This presentation is not going to do much more than describe the way the sector looks at the moment and offer a few reflections. I can assure you, though, that the primary interest of CIW will always be what is achieved for children. If I could have the first slide, please. The next slide, sorry. So I hope you can see that well. This is the way the sector looked at the end of March last year, so end of March 2021. So just under 4,000 services providing 84,500 places. And as you can see, childminders continue to make up the largest single category of service, while daycare, as you might expect, provides by far the largest number of places. It's important to note that this represents those services registered with CIW. It doesn't take account of other forms of childcare. For example, that which takes place for less than 2 hours, or informal childcare provided by relatives, and so on. And the other thing to note is, as I said, this is, as you can see, this is the end of March 2021. The pandemic has had an impact, and we've still got around 200 or so services that are temporarily closed as a result of the pandemic, either through outbreaks of COVID or staffing shortages. So I suspect the next SASS, when we run it, will reveal a decline probably in the number of services. So if I can have the next slide, please. There we are. So in the last 3 years, there's been a decline in the number of services and an increase in the number of places. The decline in the number of services is largely fueled by the relatively well publicised decline in the number of childminders, and the increase in places by the growth in the number of full daycare services and the expansion of existing daycare services to offer more. There's also been a decline in the amount of creche and open access play provision. So there's a suggestion there, isn't there, that the more resilient services in recent years are those that have had economies of scale. These figures obviously raise a bit of a concern about the choices open to parents as they look for childcare. Of particular note is the decline in the number of childminders. Now, there's going to be a Welsh Government-sponsored review of childminding that will consider the reasons for this decline, amongst other questions. For our part in CIW, we're aware that childminding has always had a significant turnover as people's circumstances change. Perhaps of late, and exacerbated by the pandemic, concerns about financial viability have heightened. And of course, the employment market has been relatively buoyant, perhaps surprisingly buoyant, given the circumstances. This may be part of the reason for decline. What is less clear is whether the decline might be a consequence of parental choice, a preference for full or sessional daycare. I think the big unknown here is the medium and long-term impact of the pandemic. Anecdotal evidence suggests that the rise of home working or blended working with less people tied to offices and office hours may mean that more families will work out ways to look after their children that require less or no childcare. But we really don't know yet. And of course, to state the obvious point, there are lots of people for whom home working isn't an option anyway. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. In terms of the workforce, CIW's information team, our information team, estimate, and I estimate is underlined there because it's based on incomplete information from the SASS. So these are really, ballpark, rough and ready figures. We estimate that the childcare sector employs over 17,000 people. That's in the services that are registered with us. Over a third of those services report at least one member of staff leaving in the 12 months to the end of March 2021. So the point to note is childcare is a significant employer in Wales. And as Sue said in her introduction, you are a big part of the Welsh economy. If I could have the next slide, please. So this one looks more complicated than it actually is, really. It shows the impact of the pandemic on the services and the workforce that I've just been describing. The red represents temporary closures, the blue, those services that remained open. And as you can see, at the height of the first wave, a half of the services registered with us were temporarily closed. That's where the red meets the blue in the graph there. During this time, CIW made thousands of check-in calls to providers, doing our best to signpost people to sources of advice and support, and checking on arrangements in those services that remained open. To begin, those calls were very much simply check-in calls. As time went on, they changed to more detailed monitoring calls, in which we gathered information to help us come to a view about the quality and safety of services. And where we received significant concerns about safety and well-being, we continued to visit services to inspect. In total, during the first and second stages of the pandemic, we made over 4,000 calls and carried out 93 inspections. At times, I know providers, I know yourselves, were frustrated with CIW for not being able to quickly respond to questions, particularly about finance or public health guidance. But I think we quickly got better at working in partnership with colleagues in Welsh Government to signpost people to best sources of advice and support. It is, of course, heartening that the end of the chart shows a sea of blue. But of course, some of those services will not have opened at the same capacity as previously, and all in one way or another will have been affected by the pandemic. Those of you from North Wales may have seen the media reports last week about the sudden closure of a nursery in Anglesey. I'd like to just read you a quote from the manager of the nursery that was in the press. Stacey says she was aware the pandemic had impacted the company's finances, but the sudden closure was completely unexpected. She explained, "I knew there were less children coming in and that was going to have an effect, but I never saw this coming." So this is the point where this presentation could dwell on the negative impact of the pandemic. And goodness knows it was a negative and sometimes personally tragic experience for many people and for the services that you provide. So what I'm about to say in no way seeks to minimize that impact. and the personal and professional cost it exacted. But I do want to say a little something about some of the positive things that our engagement with providers, whether through check-in calls, monitoring calls, or inspections, has shown, and also just to reiterate the Deputy Minister's comments about additional investment and support going into childcare and play now and in the future. If I could have the next slide, please. And just a word of warning, I think I am going to run into the fire test, so I apologise for that when it happens. Firstly, those services that stayed open were innovative and creative in how they managed things, from making the use of bubbles in nurseries for children fun by children wearing different coloured bibs, to quickly and brilliantly adapting the approach to infection control. Many of you provided a vital service for those working at the front line in tackling the pandemic, enabling people to go to work confident in the knowledge that their children were safe and well cared for. No action is required. And some of those services that closed temporarily kept in touch with their children and enabled children to still see their friends through virtual and online activities, such as story time and song time. And I'm going to pause there to let this alarm finish. There are some more words to come. I will pick it up again when it's finished. Just give me a second. I do apologise.
Dyma gyhoeddiad am yr adeilad. Mae'r prawf larwm tân ar ben. Diolch am eich cydweithrediad. This is a building announcement. The fire alarm test is now complete. Thank you for your cooperation.
There we are. Thank you for your indulgence there. So we saw great partnership working, whether through the NDNA or PACey reaching out to their sector, or local authority childcare leads working really hard to provide advice and support about the myriad and constantly changing options for finance and guidance, and providers helping each other. For our part in CIW, it was instructive to have a conversation with providers that was not focused directly on the findings from an inspection. We are the regulator, of course, and the bottom line is that the public expects us to take action when services are failing their children. But the majority of services do a fine job, and it was good to have grown-up conversations with you about that. And you kept going in the interests of children. Your persistence and resilience was amazing. Thank you. And the sixth and final slide, please. So my final thoughts are about the need to build on these positives so that recovery is actually about creating something better than before. A renewal in which all partners, including CIW, are focused on what needs to be done to improve what we offer to children. We have resumed our joint inspections with Estin, and we will be resuming publishing ratings for our single agency inspections in April. In the coming years, I'd like all of us to think what we can do to help the majority of services become good and aim for excellence. And we won't achieve that without good partnership working and unless we all pull together. Diolch yn fawr, thank you. My last words there were about partnership working, and clearly, of course, a big part of CIW's partnership working is with Estin in relation to the joint inspections for some of the services in the non-maintained sector. So I'm going to turn briefly now back to Jonathan, who's going to say a little bit about the joint inspections that we do together. Diolch yn fawr pawb, thank you very much.
Diolch, Kevin, and it is going to be very brief, I promise, at the end. But just to give you a bit of an update, as you are aware, we paused our joint inspections of all non-maintained settings in March 2020 due to COVID-19. Estin and CIW have now resumed our joint inspections in January this year. Prior to this, we consulted widely on our inspection framework, including sending a questionnaire to all settings. The feedback we received was overwhelmingly positive, and thank you to all of you who took the time out to actually have a look through the framework and make some suggestions. And we did take into consideration feedback to make some changes. For example, we've removed any duplication across themes. We've revised areas such as additional learning needs and teaching and assessment to align with policy changes, and also strengthened the focus in Theme 5 on the setting's use of the premises and resources. We published our revised guidance towards the end of last year on both Estyn and CIW's websites. As we resume core joint inspection activity, we just want to ensure you that inspectors will be proportionate and take account of the setting circumstances and the impact of the pandemic on children's outcomes, provision, and leadership and management. Consequently, during the spring term, we decided not to publish overall summative judgments to individual inspection themes, and we've said we will keep this under review. We will, however, continue to apply our follow-up procedures, and CIW will apply their securing, improvement and enforcement policy as necessary. So that was just a quick update on our joint inspections, ond unwaith eto, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi bore yma am y cyfle I ddod I siarad â chi, a gobeithio eich bod mwynhau gweddill diwrnod. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak to you this morning, and hopefully that you'll enjoy the rest of the conference today. Diolch yn fawr.